Welcome to the first screencast for Chapter 3, Ecosystem Ecology and Biomes. First, let's revisit the term ecosystem. Remember, that's a particular place on Earth. It could be of any size, small or very large. And within an ecosystem, there is interaction between biotic and abiotic components. In other words, between living things and non-living components of the system. And within an ecosystem, matter cycles and energy flows. So we'll look at the ecology of that, and we'll also look at how ecosystems can be classified into biomes or biological homes, where climate, in other words, temperature and precipitation, determine what type of plant life can exist there, and therefore, as you move to higher levels, what types of animals also live there. Okay, so let's move on and look at some of these. Okay, so again, the definition of ecosystem, a particular location on Earth distinguished by a particular mix of biotic and abiotic components. So let's look at more detail as to what makes up the biotic and what makes up the abiotic components. So the biotic components would include plants, animals, microorganisms such as bacteria, fungi, viruses, which are technically not biotic because they don't have DNA, but they do reproduce, so we're going to keep them in the biotic category here, and of course animals. If you're wondering about protists, they're those fun organisms like amoeba that really don't fit into any of these other categories. Okay, abiotic components. The A in front of a word means not. So not living components. That includes the air and the gases that make up the atmosphere, the flow of the air, the sunlight, temperature, the soil and the types of minerals that are in that soil, water, whether there's a large amount or a little amount, is it fresh or salt, pH, and the nutrients that make up that particular ecosystem. So in the case of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, the abiotic components determine which organisms can live in an ecosystem. And in particular, temperature and amount of water or precipitation make the biggest difference. Okay, as we've mentioned one or two times, energy flows through an ecosystem and matter cycles within an ecosystem. So let's take a forest ecosystem. Matter cycles. Trees fall down when they die and then they're decomposed, and all of that carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus that were in that tree eventually is broken down by other living things and is recycled back up into the environment. So maybe some of that gets into the soil, which then new plants take up. Energy flowing through an ecosystem. Well, the energy flow for most ecosystems starts with sunlight, which flows through an ecosystem and provides the energy that's needed for photosynthesis, and then it moves through other organisms as well, non-photosynthetic organisms. Okay, so here we're going to take a closer look at photosynthesis and respiration, processes that we introduced in a previous chapter, but we'll look a little more carefully at them. So we have a vocabulary term here in green, producers. Those are organisms that are able to use the sun's energy to produce usable energy through photosynthesis. So the producers might be a plant, it might be a blue-green algae, for example, anything that converts sun energy through photosynthesis into basic units such as glucose. And we'll look at the equation for that again in a minute. Virtually all ecosystems on Earth obtain their biological energy from the sun. And then all living things also release that energy through a process called respiration, or unlocking, using the energy that's stored in food to power all of the activities a cell or an organism needs. such as growing, reproducing, moving. Now we're going to take a look at the textbook's diagrams which represent photosynthesis and respiration. And the basic units are shown. I'm not sure they're really shown in the best way, so let's take a little glance at it. The top half of the diagram is photosynthesis, where the sun's energy comes in and is received and converted by tissues within the plant. CO2 is also brought in, 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules, and then through the process of photosynthesis, those are converted to 6 oxygen atoms and 1 molecule of glucose, which is C6H12O6. Now, some of the issues that I have with this diagram is that, first of all, this leaf is not how the plant brings in water. It is how the plant takes in carbon dioxide. There are small openings in the bottom of a leaf, and with those carbon dioxide molecules are brought in that way. But the water is brought in through the roots. So if you have a house plant and you covered up the soil so that all that showed were the leaves and you tried watering it, that plant would die. Okay, you can water the leaves all you want, but it doesn't take in water that way, so it would eventually die because it can only take them in through the roots. Okay, some of the other issues with not showing a plant here, showing an entire plant and just showing a leaf, is the glucose doesn't just kind of fall out of the leaf here. Some of the food molecules will be stored in the leaf, some will be stored in a stem, and some will be stored in a root. If you had a carrot, for example, they have small leaves on the top there, and they put a lot of the food molecule storage into the root instead. And oxygen does leave the plant through, again, stomata, through openings at the bottom of the leaf, so that's relatively accurate there. Now, on the bottom, respiration is represented with this little mouse, and it's accurately showing some 6 molecules of oxygen being breathed in, and 1 molecule of glucose being eaten if it's eating this grass. And it's showing energy coming out. Well, the energy is actually being used by the mouse for all of its living functions. It's showing 6 CO2 coming out, but typically in an organism such as this one, the CO2 would be breathed outward. So we would have, I'd put the CO2 coming out over here. And it does show 6 molecules of water coming out, perhaps as urine. Some of it would be breathed out as water vapor as well. My main quibble with this particular diagram is that it makes it look like plants do photosynthesis and animals do respiration, but in fact, all organisms, including plants, respire. Okay, so in the example of the leaf, if we were to bring in the oxygen, which it does, it also brings in CO2 through those same openings in the leaf. Okay, so now we're going to take a turn to look more at the ecological aspect of this, how there are different feeding levels and how energy moves through those different feeding levels. So let's take a look at that now. Okay, so we have 2 food chains, very simplistic representations of an actual food web. And on the left we have terrestrial, that means land, and on the right we have aquatic, which means in water. Could be fresh water, could be salt water. So let's look first at the terrestrial food chain. You have a producer, an organism which does photosynthesis, captures the sun's energy, and in this ecosystem it would be the grasses. Then you have an organism which consumes grasses, and that's called a primary consumer. So first level of eating. So don't let the word primary confuse you with producers, okay? Primary consumer means first level of eating. And in the Serengeti case, that would be a zebra dining on grass. And continuing up the food chain, we have a secondary consumer represented here by the lion, which would eat the zebra and the wildebeest and other organisms in that ecosystem. So that's a secondary consumer. On land, we don't often get beyond the secondary consumer to a tertiary consumer, but it does happen. So let's take a look at an aquatic food chain. So here we have producers, which are algae. So in other words, these are organisms that can convert the sun's energy through photosynthesis. A primary consumer of algae might be some zooplankton, some very small organisms which dine on the algae. Above those, we have a secondary consumer level, which is represented by the fish that eat the zooplankton. And we have represented here a tertiary consumer, such as a bald eagle or an osprey, or something that would dine on the fish, or a seagull perhaps in our case. So take a moment here to picture a simplified food chain in our own area here on Cape Cod. What might we have here? We don't have any zebras. Perhaps we have some rabbits dining on the grasses, and perhaps we have some foxes or coyotes dining on the rabbits. And then we have, again, the end of that food level chain. Let's take human consumers. Pause for a minute to think about, how do we eat? Are we ever producers? No, we can't do photosynthesis. Cool as that would be, we don't have the ability to do that. Are we ever primary consumers? Yes, anytime we eat a salad or some fruit, we're eating at a primary consumer level. And if you're a vegetarian, you would stay at that level. Are we ever a secondary consumer? Yes, we are. If we eat beef or a cow that dines on grasses, then we're being a secondary consumer. Are humans ever tertiary consumers? Yes, we are, if you consider an aquatic food chain, of course, that starts with algae. Let's say you're eating a salmon. Salmon eat smaller fish, which eat smaller fish, which eat zooplankton, which get their energy from algae. So there are certainly situations where we are tertiary consumers. So this is relevant as we look a little bit later in this chapter into how energy transfers through these various levels and has consequences for us eating at different levels. So with the time that remains here, let's look at a real food web. It's typically not a food chain, but a food web. Now this one also shows the Serengeti, the plains of Africa, where the zebras and wildebeest and lions reside, and giraffes and all kinds of incredible creatures. And it starts at the producer level here with grasses represented in green. Then anything that eats the grasses is a primary consumer. So here we have a hare eating the grass. And you also have zebra eating the grass. And you'll notice the arrow moves from the grass to the hare, not the other direction. So even though the hare consumes the grass, what this is showing is the movement of energy in this ecosystem. So the energy is moving from the grass to the hare. And then the secondary consumer, in this case the cheetah, the energy moves from the hare to the cheetah. Okay, you can also see not only is energy moving through here, but matter is also moving through the system. So we have scavengers shown in dark brown. Scavengers will eat the carcasses. Then we have detritivores and decomposers. Detritivores break down dying and dead tissue into smaller pieces, but not all the way down into basic tiny units. The decomposers take that tissue down